Hello, my name is Sam Glassenberg, CEO and founder of LevelX. I'm here with entrepreneur, best-selling author, and founder, president, and CEO of Brainlab, Stefan Vilsmeyer. Brainlab creates software-driven medtech, digitizing, automating, and optimizing clinical workflows. Founded back in 1989 and headquartered in Munich, where Stefan's dialing in for us now, uh, Brainlab serves physicians, medical professionals, and patients in over 5,800 hospitals across 117 countries worldwide. Brainlab revolutionized digital medical technology back when they introduced software for radiosurgery and for surgical navigation. Today, Brainlab leads the industry in innovation with surgical navigation, precision radiotherapy, and digital operating room integration. And as of last year, Brainlab is the parent company of LevelX.
For many of maybe the industry participants basically ask themselves, what would a company like Brainlab, want to do with basically a company that makes computer games for surgeons? And that to many sounded a bit, awkward. But I think for us, our ambition was always to digitize surgery. So, when you think about it, digitizing surgery, well, on the one hand, you have really you need to track maybe a surgical instrument and understand its how to say correlation and interaction with tissue, and so you need perfect models, almost like a digital copy or twin of the patients and patient. And we need to create a link between the digital and the physical world. And so the element that level X in a way adds to that is basically we consider that to be the digital copy of the surgical workflow. And so basically, while every surgeon is used to practice things in the physical world, now there's basically a virtual way to go through exactly the same workflow and the same learning and thought patterns. And so therefore, it's basically the digital copy of the real world when it comes to a procedure and learning and medical practice. And then, of course, getting that synchronized with the physical world is what we really do. So for us, it was really a very important strategic move, but also it really gives access to basically adequate and accelerated learning in a number of different areas. Because being a technology company, for us, the challenge is always as we introduce a new technology, how can we get that basically deployed quicker? And so it's like really frustrating for me sometimes when we have the coolest new technology, but it really takes a while from the first adopters to basically the next level and basically getting really the broad market to adopt it. And so essentially level X allows us to accelerate that. And so essentially it's a technology that allows us to do some growth hacking.
Right. And this is a perfect segue into a number of the themes that we're going to talk about today, right? Because we've talked about access, and you also mentioned adoption. And this is a problem that we see not only in surgery, but across the ecosystem. There's the volume of medical knowledge is growing exponentially. And as everything from pharmaceutical treatments to surgical procedures become more complex and more technically sophisticated, the barrier to adoption can often become higher because you need to actually train on how to use these things. And this takes time. And the technologies for training haven't necessarily improved at the same rate as the technologies for genomics and pharmaceuticals and radiosurgery. So to introduce this discussion, this is themed around the health conference, which takes place once a year. Now, it's focused on digital innovation in healthcare. So the idea behind health is they bring thought leaders together from all facets of the industry to create a dialogue around digital transformation in healthcare. Now, there are a lot of conferences in digital health, and as you've probably seen, the signal to noise ratio on these is usually pretty bad. Often you go to these conferences and it's really a multiple days of playing buzzword bingo. But I found that health is the exception to that. Health, the people that are actually presenting, it's attended by leaders and decision makers. It's people who are moving the industry forward, and the people that you and I know, right, who are actually moving the industry forward in attendance. And it makes for really, in addition to the great talks, it makes for effective and efficient networking. And so what we wanted to do here was they've actually, in advance of the conference, published a few themes that they're going to be exploring at Health this year. So in advance of the conference is a bit of a sneak preview. what we figured is we would just talk through some of the themes, and Stefan, you and I will jam on them. So even though we're doing this all on a computer, I printed out the themes on note cards for effect. So we'll start out with the first one. So theme 1 is called Health Tectonic Shift, with tech separated with a hyphen, tectonic shift. And the theme is, as healthcare delivery trends toward a more digital, patient-first approach, and the number of health applications continue to rise, how can we ensure that the tech we are integrated into our lives is actually making a positive difference? So Stefan, what do you think about that? If all this, we see so much technology for technology's sake, how at Brainlab, how do you make sure that the technology that you're creating is creating the most value for medical professionals and patients?
Well, it's all a matter of training, and it goes back to when I installed the first of our systems basically 30 years ago at a small hospital in China, and the neurosurgeon was 23 years old and just finished medical schools 2 weeks before I got there, and I ended up having to put on the head frame. And for me, it was clear that training was really the key component to really drive our technology forward. So as a small company at that time, we invested very heavily into training and education, and that becomes really the key element. So even in neurosurgery, where you basically need to find a tumor and using a digital model, basically even in 70% of all cases, people would not want to go through the process of outlining the tumor and basically just say, I'll just aim, and eventually on the screen I'll see when the tumor pops up. So I think that the theoretical possibilities in healthcare are tenfold greater to what is basically implemented in broad clinical practice. And for that reason, I think that we need to just add a whole different level of proficiency that is basically can be rolled out faster and more broadly than basically today's technology. So basically, and also you can say that best practice guidelines and also insights in how technology is being used are changing all the time with new insights. So even the speed by which we need to be able to adopt a best practice guideline and roll out something new is basically really completely shifting. For example, during the COVID crisis, essentially the way of how you learned to intubate a patient has really changed, and that's probably what you can really talk to about, Sam.
Exactly, and so I think we've seen over the last year there's been a digital transformation in terms of how doctors learn, but it, in many cases, hasn't been for the better, right? We've gone from being able to train a doctor in person as a group or potentially in the operating room, and now with COVID, a lot of that has shifted to Zoom, which, as we know, is often we've gone from being able to manipulate a mannequin together or touch it, manipulate a device together, and now we're trying to show somebody using PowerPoint slides over Zoom. And so in that case, we've seen that sort of digital transformation have a negative effect. But one of the things that Level X has been working on, and we've been deploying across the industry, Brainlab has been using it, is our cloud gaming platform, Remote Play, where a surgeon and a trainer or multiple surgeons can together over Zoom or Microsoft Teams or WebEx can actually interact with a virtual patient together that's simulated in the cloud. So now what happens is that Zoom or MS Teams remote learning experience is actually better, because now instead of being limited to a mannequin or a cadaver or the particular case that's presented on the table, we can jump to a certain step in the procedure, we can rotate the angle so we can see it from the right view, and we can actually go to the particular patient scenario that matches that epitomizes or represents the educational gap that we're trying to close in this particular discussion.
The main part of that is that we are now adding an interactive component to it.
Yes.
And that goes from basically the least effective way of learning something new is lectures. And basically the whole world has gone over the last 18 months from things that we've been able to try out, which is the most effective way of learning, almost in a sandbox, being able to really, just try something yourself, and that's the best way of how you learn. It almost doesn't matter what you learn, basically, little children, when they take the first steps, etc., and to, how our ancestors have learned to how to throw a spear. All of that is basically driven by, trying things out. And basically, within the pandemic, we've gone again to lecture mode, which is basically a lot harder, but also a lot less efficient. So basically more effective is in fact reading, is better than basically just being lectured at. And basically, but then again, the most effective way is trying things out. And so providing a digital way of trying things out yourself, where you basically, have your sandbox by, which you can basically run different scenarios, different variations, try different decisions. That's basically what is really the difference. And without that, I don't think that we will be able to the adequate healthcare that the world needs. Because we have, in most of the Western world, an aging population, patients are demanding better and better healthcare, and without digital transformation and AI, etc., we won't be able to just meet those expectations. But how do we make sure that we don't leave people behind? Because for a successful digital transformation, I think we need three things. We need basically technology. We need essentially access to data. And we need to change something in the mindset and the readiness of the people. And so basically level X and the opportunity of using computer games for accelerated learning is basically the best thing I've seen in 30 years for really making an impact, and making an impact not only basically in people that live in the Western world, where they could easily jump in a car and drive to a training center and attend basically some of the best medical schools, but it's actually something that democratizes access to adequate healthcare by essentially, just going to any place. And everybody has nowadays basically a mobile device that essentially gives you access to basically then that type of training education. So it really is something that unites us. And it also, now the sudden with more quickly rolling out new best practices, etc., but also customizing it to different basic parts of the world, and the access of technology in those parts, I think is a very exciting perspective that I really believe will put technology at use for the benefit of physicians and their patients.
So dare we say the best way to learn something is to play with it, right? That is the best way to explore a topic and develop a mental model with the most rigor. Moving from lectures on one side to reading to, watching to actually interacting with something. So what you've been describing actually aligns really well with theme 3 of the health conference, which is health for the greater good. So at Health 2020, Lloyd Dean said, healthcare is a right, not a luxury. Yet our current health system, especially here in the United States, struggled with the uninsured, the undercared for, underrepresented, underwhelmed individuals. How can we close the care gaps made worse by the pandemic and remove the social and economic barriers to accessing the best care possible? And I would extend that, Stefan, in your context, is to the world at whole, right? How do we, what insights do you have from a global perspective on how we can increase democratization and increase access to care?
When I started really, building my company 30 years ago, what caught my mind was the idea of software being something that you almost can scale and replicate in a completely, in a way that we couldn't have imagined, 30, 40 years ago. And so basically now mobile devices and different other technologies and AI and cloud computing are almost like taking that to an entire, different level. And being basically, having started a company, what I always want to do from day one is have impact with what I do. And I always found healthcare to be exactly that area. And obviously, having grown up in Europe, we have, basically also a mindset where basically education, many things are free, and also the expectation to also, give back to society is basically, different. And also what really drives employees today is basically not necessarily to just maximize their income, but also to basically work for a company that basically is, engaged in projects. So we have basically provided technology in countries that otherwise couldn't afford it a long time ago. And I think that, and now the sudden having something like Level X is basically the technology that really will virtualize education. I think that the next step is also to virtualize those expensive navigation systems. And I think mixed reality and Magic Leap is a way of doing that, where instead of a $250,000 hardware big device that you need to wheel into the operating room, you'll be able to put on a basic couple of $1,000 headset, maybe a $5,000 headset, and now all of a sudden you will be able to basically see with X-ray eyes through the patient and basically immediately capture maybe a complex anatomical problems, trauma, etc. And then finally, we will also find cheaper ways of turning operating rooms digital. So basically something that was more or less a device that only the first world was able to afford. I think that digital technology is just about to shift gears. So very similar to how the cell phone technology has allowed basically some of the emerging countries to to leapfrog what is basically implemented in the first world, and you find better cell phone coverage throughout most parts of India than you do find in basically Manhattan, is basically just a reason why I think there's really hope for better access basically in those countries. It starts with training. So basically, level X, in my opinion, is really a critical component to that. But then also the technology is basically more accessible, and so is the data. So but what we really need to do is we also need to build a basically more powerful system that's basically based on sharing information and data. And I think that a lot of the business models in healthcare are built around selling a disposable that really costs $5 to make for $1,000, and building a complex hardware infrastructure around that. So software is not used what it's meant to, like this universal, interoperable, scalable concept, but something that is used as a proprietary system to basically make to maximize lock-in effects of a certain hardware. So I think those business models will be a model of the past. And I just basically I think patients should really demand increasingly access to adequate healthcare, and we as a company want to do everything to basically really facilitate that by also coming up with more flexible and software-driven business models and concepts, and that will also be definitely data-driven. And the question of where even the development of technology will take place in 5 or 10 years from now is also going to be dependent on data. And I think that there can be certainly maybe emerging markets that can really lead the way of how they basically capture their data, how they make their data accessible, and how they become now all of a sudden an interesting place for basically developing the next generation of healthcare technology. And basically those developments will also be driven by AI and software developers. And I find entrepreneurship in a number of places around the world that you wouldn't really expect, and the ability to shape healthcare through AI, etc., isn't any longer a privilege of basically Europe and the US and Japan. So it's a number of other markets from, I don't know, say Malaysia and China and other markets that are still developing markets that now all of a sudden are coming with lots of innovation and a fresh new mindset, and basically not being entrenched in those maybe in this sometimes structural contingencies that basically result in a gridlock of the system, is sometimes an opportunity to even out innovate basically the Western world, I would say.
So I think the point that you made, getting back to AR headsets, is actually intriguing, because we think about the opportunity and potential of AR, right? We think about having a Magic Leap headset and the benefit to the surgeon and the patient of being able to project the MRI or the CT or the ultrasound view on top of the patient that you're looking at, so you don't have to register in your brain what you see on the screen. And then from there we look at the educational benefits. Now we can take that same headset and project a virtual patient over here and practice doing the procedure beforehand. But the point that you made is really interesting, because as we do this, we're actually democratizing access to the broader suite of technologies. Because with an AR headset, instead of needing, $1 million of equipment and screens and all the complexity, you put it on, you push a button, and you can create a virtual endoscopy suite, or you could create a virtual cath lab, or you could create a virtual OR, and the screens are all placed correctly, and you have all the tools that you need, all the visualizations, and you could also project the training material on top of it. And what this would do is it doesn't just improve the situation in developed countries, but it lowers the barrier to entry for developing countries to be able to build out this infrastructure, because so much of it exists in software. And really what's enabling that is a headset that costs a few $1,000s, and it's just the software on top of it. So I think that's a really interesting way to think about it. Go ahead.
And you will be able to press a button, and at the push of a button, you get an expert to basically be available online that could be, at a different part, different corner of the world, who basically may be, a teacher for a new procedure, a new concept, maybe helping you to basically not just take care of a very, rare case or special situation. It could be a clinical support, it could be also technical support. So this is something that will also be important for rural areas in the developed world, but basically something that really is equally applicable, anywhere. And that may also be that basically several services may be reading basically, a CT scans for a radiology report might potentially be done at an equal level, but cheaper by other countries. And so I think that therefore there is also going to be a different level of competition for basically services and quality around the world, and that quality needs to be measured and also characterized. And I think that takes us maybe to another important topic, which is how we can create a data ecosystem that really would be patient-centric and patient-determined, where patients are basically in charge of their own destiny, where it's not a matter of big platform companies basically more or less having everything from a life insurance to an activity tracker, coupled with basically your healthcare insurance, and a drone that then delivers your basically 3D printed truck. So it's a great new world, but I don't think for me as a patient that would meet my own basically say values in terms of privacy, etc. So for that reason, I think we need to put patient in the center, and basically give the patient control over their own data in a very privacy preserving and secure way. And so this is in fact where we believe that being a European company is of tremendous value, because Europe, and in Germany in particular, has basically the highest interpretation of the European GDPR laws. And so it's probably, Brainlab has picked the toughest market as a home for developing a data-driven system. However, I think we have started to really look at how can we build a data ecosystem that would also meet basic broad basically society consensus. And it's becoming pretty clear that it wouldn't fly if basically we are more or less taking over the toll booth and control access to data. So we need to do that in a very liberal and broad way, which still makes it open and accessible to others. Basically, as long as something is covered by the patient consent, then we are basically more or less just a contractually committed execution entity of basically the patient's will, so to speak. We also think that a patient consent should be standardized, and it should be given once and then basically applicable to all the data. And basically, if we are more or less helping to consolidate the data, we should be privileged in our access to the data over other users. And whether patients want to really improve healthcare through basically just their clinical research, or through science and fundamental research, or industry-led research, therefore should really be at the patient's discretion. But I think that all of them would be important. So in Europe, we have this mindset that sometimes, it should be just research, but a scientific paper can never really provide products that really serve broad majority of patients. So for that reason, I think it's important that there's really a broader discussion, and also a trusted infrastructure that enables that. And I think that a lot of times people just think that if we just made available all the data that is there, then things will be great. But even if you handed over the hard disks of basically all the hospitals in, let's say, the US or Germany, there's really, basically it's just garbage that basically you wouldn't be able to process in a meaningful way with, just a few exceptions. But basically, if you actually were to structure the data in a more careful way, if you would capture it at the point of care in a structured way and not just as a basically text that somebody typed in, that basically is very difficult to really make sense of because a lot of biases in the way of how the data has been processed. There needs to be basically innovation, and also innovation is being encouraged in the entire data value chain, as I would basically put it. And that's what we're focusing on recently. And we're looking at doing that across a number of clinical subspecialties, and also doing that in different countries. For example, there's 42 knee and hip registries worldwide. Nothing scales, 2 or 3 person companies each. They hardly scale on a national level, and certainly not on an international level. And basically you need today in a data ecosystem, you should have structured radiology reports and patient-reported outcome measures and images that can be processed with AI, and special clinical data, and also everything that's coming from the hospital information system. And to bring all that together in a trusted way is tough. And so we're doing something that hopefully will work in Germany. And if it works in Germany, it works in Europe. And what works in Europe is also something that I think can also be adopted globally, and considering that even some states in the US, such as California, etc., are adopting several concepts from basically the GDPR. And there's also an ongoing debate about the power that Amazon should really have. I think it's a wonderful company that basically we use as well, but basically I think that basically using them in basic cloud computing, I think, or Microsoft, whatever, is basically the role that those companies should play. But I'm not sure that they should also be providing basically consumer services that are, for building customer profiles with basically mapping services and tracking and speech control, etc. And on the other hand, also be processing our most private data. They should be, doing either or of the two. And so for that reason, we're trying to build that ecosystem, and that will also have to do with basically providing better healthcare to basically a broad area of the world. Today, we're hosting a Brainlab, a craniomaxillofacial symposium. It's probably one of the most technically sophisticated subspecialties, but also one of the smallest surgical subspecialties. And so unless you really pool all the data globally, I think you're unlikely to really just collect enough data that will basically really further the practice. And that's also, I would say, a subspecialty where almost like every single patient is custom, all the way to even custom implants. So therefore, collecting data, finding better ways for training, because the cases are so rare, is just really essential. And so it's really an exciting moment where Brainlab together with Level X can really shape the future of digital health.
So I think one of the interesting areas that you started touching on was on Brainlab's work in standardizing, structuring data and creating standardized registries, so that data can be more broadly available and be used for all of this, these broad beneficial purposes, but obviously while respecting the privacy of the individual, of the individual patient. So one of the theme 2 is life sciences game changers, and you had alluded to some of the disciplines and specialties that you're working in. So the theme is basically that around throughout 2021, there have been incredible advancements in fields such as genomics and oncology. And these are catapulting us into a new era of science. How is this changing the game? And you started to talk about these registries. Can you talk a little bit about what Brainlab is doing specifically around oncology to help accelerate the development of new treatments?
So, well, we're seeing a couple of important trends. First of all, there's always a distinction from what is a clinical study and what is routine care. And they are like 2 distinct areas, but I think the distinction will go away. And basically, I think it's really crucial and important step that all becomes one, and that every patient, would get the data collected and processed at the same level as if it were a clinical study. And basically that, that will also move us from doing only basically prospective, clinical trials to basically a retrospective and continuous analysis of, what some people also call, additionally real world data, including basic patient reported outcome measures and continuous data that may be collected from activity trackers and the like, so that basically you can build a more complete understanding of, how patients are doing. And basically for an oncology patient, for example, it all starts with how you even capture the diagnosis in the first place. So, right now, which is of course for, many patients devastating basic news, if you're diagnosed with cancer, is basically you're getting more or less a written report, and most clinical oncologists look at the report and then from there drive their basic decisions. But basically two things, that are, I think, important. One is that basically all those patients are followed, and you are developing a number of longitudinal data. So if you don't develop that, or if you don't capture that with the same tools, so that the radiology report is not generated, copy paste, but really generated from basically the same tools that are able to quantify any subtle change in the tumor volume, using maybe in the background 50 radiomics that analyze maybe subtle changes in tissue and composition and patterns of the tumor. Then you get a lot of valuable data that allows you to quantify the change in tissue. So this way you get basically for every cancerous disease much more detailed and valuable data. So you'll be able to basically recognize a change in the body's reaction on a drug, etc., much earlier, and you might be able to develop much better predictors whether a therapy is working. But also basically the same would also be applicable to degenerative diseases, where you get basically patterns detected much earlier. So basically having starting with a structured radiology report is basically an important part. But then also most patients are not just treated with basically clinical oncology approaches. So basically 20 years ago, I remember the discussion really was that basically you can more or less get the right with the decoding of the human genome, that's going to be the silver bullet that will cure every type of cancer. So while basically a lot of progress has been made and several types of cancer have turned into chronic disease, it makes it even more important to basically follow the subtle changes in basically the composition of or the change in shape and size of the tumor. But also most patients end up getting a number of different treatments, from basically surgery to radiotherapy to immunotherapies, etc. So if you're basically trying to determine whether a particular drug was successful or how it impacted patient's journey, I think every patient is different, and we need to really capture the entire patient journey. And so therefore we need to collect the data along the way in a structured way. We need to compose that in registries, and basically then therefore we're able to much better personalize treatments. And so I think that the data that we collect from basically patients today are basically setting the the cancer treatments for our children and grandchildren. So I think therefore not collecting data, I think, is basically killing patients at scale. And I think it's a moral basic obligation, I think, today of basically just all of us to basically contribute with our own data to basically just the future of healthcare. And I think it's even more dramatic and even more important, and it's already pretty important, to basically just be donating your organs. But I think that it's even more critical to do that with data, because the data isn't gone, it's still yours and you can still use it. You just basically have to share it with others. And basically not sharing data, I think, is really just a problem. And so therefore creating the ecosystem that allows you to do that in a systematic way is important. I see more and more pharmaceutical companies starting to insource some of their clinical research efforts. And so for that reason, providing better data is important, but it's also important to hospitals. Hospitals today have their hospital information systems, which are basically more or less collecting data from billing, etc. And can certainly still, Yeah, exactly. And you can probably still search, who had what allergy, but then it almost like stops there. But they don't really capture the whole wealth of clinical data. So on top of that, I think you need to have a layer where for clinical search, but also for research and studies, etc., and also personalizing each patient treatment. You need to be able to capture the clinical information with a whole different level of granularity. And so basically, since it's difficult to really engage for many players in that area, we have basically also created a spin-off called SnakeOS, which is basically the idea of providing access to the fundamental software tools for basically taking the data, aggregating it, putting that all in a cloud repository, which basically, if every company needs to do that from scratch, it doesn't scale. It's hard to share. It's hard to ensure that it's interoperable. And basically, there may be a lot of med device companies that have an innovative solution that's dependent on a better access to data. For example, for optimizing the parameters or setting of a treatment. We're working very closely, for example, with Boston Scientific for deep brain stimulation of Parkinson treatment, and basically we are helping with the data that's being collected for the individual adjustments of a patient's basically brain pacemaker, so to speak. So even the settings for that can be really fine-tuned around the specific requirements of each patient. And that is dependent on data, and it's dependent on data from a healthy patient as well as patients that suffer from exactly that disease. And I believe that we are at the beginning of a very, very exciting journey. And so basically, as bad as it is to be diagnosed with a basically life-threatening disease, there's never been a better time than today, or a more encouraging time to basically provide the best treatment than today. There isn't basically anything that's would deserve the name good old times, I think.
Right. No, I think you make an intriguing point here about the degree to which technologies that you've developed for surgical use, for acute challenges in surgical oncology, are now proving to be incredibly relevant and helpful in medical oncology. It's not like one is superseding the other, but quite the opposite. The technologies that you've been developing at Brainlab in order to identify tumors, to size them, to understand their position, and to be able to take that data and present it in a structured way is highly relevant to be able to measure the outcomes of either clinical studies or ongoing patient treatment with clinical treatment. So I think that's very exciting and probably not something that most are aware of.
So, I think that really bring all the different elements together. And, I think that, considering the Brainlab has been in its business for 30 years, 30 years ago, you were not a good neurosurgeon if you needed certain software. So today you're not a good neurosurgeon if you do, most of your procedures without the proper software. So fortunately, times have changed. And I think basically Brainlab built its current technology base with probably investment of basically about $700 million, just cumulative. And so therefore, a lot of core technology, has basically been put together that I think we're now going to be able to put together. And so there is going to be a number of probably startups, but also bigger companies that basically have an ecosystem, and they just need basically a way to basically anonymize the patient data, or basically if you want to develop a magic leap application, you don't really start from scratch of building the patient model and how do you do the tracking and where do you transfer the data and how we can securely have a cloud and how do you basically build from the 2D data, 3D model, and something that everybody would need to do from scratch. Now all of a sudden you put on the headset and basically everything will be taken care of, so that basically in the future with basically 2 or 3 software engineers, you can basically in 18 months put out a clinical application that basically otherwise you probably need to hire maybe 100 people to develop. And so that's the idea. Also basically making advanced technology accessible in a much broader way. So it's basically, again, technology, it's the access to data, and it's the access to training to basically make sure that people get the best out of the technology and are fully able to utilize the technology, which basically we will do through Level X.
And through democratizing the technology and democratizing the data, it's not just increasing access to increasing access to care for patients or increasing access to technology for the healthcare providers. But what you're describing is basically it's also increasing access and democratizing healthcare innovation itself, because the barrier to entry to innovate in healthcare, if you're a new healthcare startup,
Yep.
is now much lower, because you don't have to develop your own registration system. You don't need to develop your own tracking system. You don't need to develop your own tumor measurement system. You can use the state of the art and then build on top of that. And as such, we can, just another layer in accelerating the creation and the adoption curve of new technologies in the healthcare ecosystem. A lot of food for thought here. Stefan, thank you so much for sitting down with me today to share thoughts and chat about these topics. We've definitely got to find an excuse to do this again soon. To our viewers, thanks again for tuning in. For those that are actually going to be participating in the health conference, LevelX, we'd love to continue the conversation with you during the event. Please reach out if you'd be interested in meeting with us. As always, for more information or to request a demo of any cool LevelX technologies, please visit us at levelx.com. For more information about Brainlab, please visit brainlab.com. Thank you.